Hi, everybody. Hello, everybody. My name is Marius Roodt. I work on campaigns here at the Institute of Race Relations. Today, we'll be talking about uh, the labour regulations and the Employment Equity Amendment Act, which is implementing, which is basically going to implement, or is going to force private companies to implement quotas to meet certain meet BE regulations, and it's basically making companies fulfill the South African government's racial edicts. So to talk about this today is my colleague Mdluli. Mlondi is a campaign manager at the Institute of Race Relations, and he has a master's degree in economics from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So so both of us will be talking a little bit about the the Employment Equity Amendment Act and what it means for South Africans, and what the Institute of Race Relations will be doing to oppose what we think is quite destructive policy and quite destructive legislation. So Mlondi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marius. I really appreciate it. So I'll begin with the slides that have been put up in front. Okay. My bad. Okay, so this is a briefing by the campaign team of the IRR, which has been working tirelessly to fight against the new nationwide race quotas that have been introduced under the amended Employment Equity Act. The amended Employment Equity Act was signed into law by President Ramaphosa in April 2023. The EEA allows Employment and Labour Minister Mdluli to set a numerical targets to pursue goals at all levels of the workforce. Under the EEA, the Minister of Employment and Labour is allowed to identify national economic sectors, which are defined as an industry or service or part of any industry. This is vague enough to let the minister be extremely specific about which businesses he targets. For any economic sector that has been identified, the minister may set numerical targets to ensure equitable representation of suitably qualified people from designated groups at all occupational levels in the workplace. It effectively reintroduces a racial no-entry criteria for government tenders, and employers may be delegated the odious pencil test duty of second-guessing a worker's racial self-identification. Under the amended EEA, the definition of small businesses has been changed so that turnover is ignored, and all that matters is whether a business has fewer than 50 employees. The IRR opposes the EA because it is inconsistent with some sections of the Constitution. It is inconsistent with Section 1 of the 1996 Constitution, which especially identifies non-racialism as a core value on which the democratic state is founded. The EA, with its emphasis on race, classification, and racial preferences, runs counter to non-racialism. Section 1 of the Constitution especially identifies the supremacy of the rule of law as a core value on which the democratic state is founded. The EA, in many instances, will compel employers to apply vague criteria and an opaque process in overturning the supposedly voluntary racial self-classifications of their employees. This is contrary to the certainty required by the rule of law. Second, it is inconsistent with Section 9 of the Constitution, which governs the right to equality. It requires equality before the law and bars unfair race and other discrimination. Section 9 prohibits unfair discrimination, whether by the state or private persons, on racial and other listed grounds. It further states that any discrimination on a listed ground is unfair unless the contrary is proved. Also, a relevance is Section 9.2, which states that to promote the achievements of equality, legislative and other measures designed to promote or protect persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination may be taken. In addition, the preferences must help advance the poor, not a self-serving political elite. Any preferences granted must also comply with the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act, that is the PPFA, which sets a limit on what is allowed. The EA contradicts the PPFA's framework by barring companies that fail to comply with the minister's unrealistic racial quotas from doing business with the government at all. Yet, under the subsidiarity principle, the PPFA, backed by the Constitution, must take a precedence over the amended EA and rules out the EA's attempt to impose pre-qualification criteria in state tendering. The IRR will be challenging the amendments of the EA in court. We have been consulting our legal team since April, when it was signed into law by President Ramaphosa. More information regarding our court challenge will be made public in the coming weeks. Now, moving on to the draft employment equity regulations. The Department of Employment and Labor published the draft employment equity regulations in the Government Gazette on 12 May 2023. It invited interested people and stakeholders to submit written comments on the draft regulations to the department by 11 June 2023. The IRR made its submission to the department before the deadline. The draft regulations are Minister Nxesi's proposed race targets that have been drawn up under the Amendment EA, which is a central feature of the government's campaign to socially engineer society, as the IRR has warned for many years. Like P.W. Botha in the 1980s, Minister Nxesi has reached a Rubicon moment in putting forward the draft regulations with their extraordinary, rigid, and complex sectorial targets. These targets disregard a host of relevant variables, including age, experience, skills, education, experience, and leadership strengths, and will often result in racial moratoria on the hiring and promotion of staff in the private sector. Though the draft regulations will apply solely to employers with 50 employees or more, roughly 85% of the former private workforce will nevertheless fall within the ambit of Minister Nxesi's rigid and more aggressive targets. A small number of credentialed and often politically connected people may benefit to some extent, but the main effect of the draft regulations will be to freeze recruitment and deter direct investment. This will add to the unemployment crisis rather than help resolve it. In time, moreover, many businesses may be pushed into retrenching staff or fined into bankruptcy, so raising the unemployment rate. This will generally worsen poverty and inequality and have a devastating consequence for the country and its people. It is also patently clear that most South Africans are opposed to Minister Nxesi's race-first policy. In the latest poll commissioned by the IRR, 49% of blacks, 53% of coloreds, 66% of whites, and 59%, 66% of Indians rather, and 59% of whites said they would prefer job appointments to be based on merits, often with extra training for the disadvantaged, than on racial targets the draft regulations proposed. Setting up a racial targets that produce racial moratoria on hiring, as took place at this came in 2022, is the opposite of non-racialism. Most people reject this approach. They want an expanding jobs market, not a shrinking one. The zero targets are both crass and formulaic. Under the draft regulations, many of the sectorial targets for Indian and colored people are set at 0.0%. These 0.0% targets are most frequently imposed against colored people and are to be enforced by fines that may in time rise as high as 10% of annual turnover for repeat offenses. Targets of 0% for Indian people in the public service have already been introduced, but we have never seen targets of 0.0% before. These targets will make it virtually impossible for Indian and colored people to obtain employment in particular sectors and provinces. For example, the draft regulations put the target for colored people at 0.0% in top and senior management position in mining and quarrying in Limpopo, as well as in manufacturing and construction. This is unjust and absurd. In addition, these 0.0% targets are at odds with the obligation under Section 15(2)(b) of the 1998 Act to further diversity in the workplace based on equal dignity and respect for all people. Similarly to the amended EEA, the IRR opposed the implementation of the draft employment equity regulations because they are unconstitutional. The draft regulations are inconsistent with Section 1 of the Constitution, which expressly identifies non-racialism as a core value on which the democratic state is founded. Section 1 of the Constitution also guarantees the supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law, and states that any legislation inconsistent with its terms is invalid. The draft regulations require employers to identify their employees by race and then apply preferential treatment to those identified as Black, in essence, African, colored, or Indian. Yet the apartheid era was marked by widespread public outrage at the Population Registration Act of 1950, which required all South Africans to be classified into similar broad categories of African, colored, Indian, and white. Secondly, the draft regulations are inconsistent with Section 9 of the Constitution, which states that everyone is equal before the law and has the right to equal protection and benefits of the law. Section 9 also prohibits unfair discrimination, whether by the state or private persons, on racial and other listed grounds. It further states that any discrimination on a listed ground is unfair unless the contrary is proved. Thirdly, it is inconsistent with Section 195 of the Constitution, which sets out the basic values and principles governing public administration in South Africa. This section calls, among other things, for a public administration that is broadly representative of the South African people. However, it also makes it clear that this objective cannot trump a host of other important needs. Section 195 provides that employment and personnel management practices in state entities must be based on ability, objectivity, and fairness, as well as the need to address the imbalances of the past. In addition, public administration must promote the efficient, economic, and effective use of resources, encourage accountability and transparency, and ensure that people's needs are responded to by a public service that is development-oriented. Under the Amendments Act, read with the draft regulations, businesses that fail to comply with the minister's racial targets or to justify their failure to do so on reasonable grounds will be barred from concluding agreements for the supply of goods and services with all organs of the state. In addition, companies which already have contracts with state entities could have those agreements cancelled for non-compliance with the Amendments Act and the draft regulations. The Amendments Act and the draft regulations will also significantly alter the procurement rules applicable to state entities. However, these statutory provisions are inconsistent with Section 217 of the Constitution, which deals with the procurement obligation of all state entities. Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Marius Roodt, who will be taking over from here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mlondi. Thanks for that overview. So I'll just be telling you a bit about what the Institute of Race Relations has proposed as a new way of doing empowerment. It's one thing to say that these regulations and the way of doing things are wrong, or just a very bad way of doing things and not giving a solution. So if we could go to the next slide, so long, please. So with South Africa there's an urgent need to address South Africa's racial poverty and economic inequality, and it's clear that we need a new model of economic empowerment. It's been 29 years since the ANC took power in 1994. There's still very high levels of poverty and socio-economic inequality which exist in South Africa. While the ANC government did pretty well in reducing poverty in the first 15 years or so of its governance, now that's kind of stagnated, and I think probably in some ways it started going backwards. I wouldn't be surprised if we see more people in poverty today than we did 5 or 6 years ago. But there's a number of barriers that the government has failed to overcome to allow people to escape poverty. We've had a very low economic growth rate for the past 15, 16 years or so. Since about the last time we had economic growth of more than 4 or 5% was in 2006, 2007, around about there towards the end of the Mbeki administration. Now we're lucky if we get more than 1%. Some people think we'll probably be in a recession this year, which is probably quite likely. What we do need is economic growth of around about 5 to 6% if we really want to make a sustainable dent in poverty and get people out of living in terrible situations. We also have one of the worst public education systems in the world. This is despite the massive resources and tax revenues that are given to it. For example, the latest Progress in International Reading Literacy study called Pearls, which was published just last month in May, found that 81% of grade 4 learners in South Africa can't read for meaning. And also South Africa, out of all the countries that were surveyed, I think there's about 20 odd countries, our children or our pupils we came stone last. And if you can't read in grade 4, it doesn't really set you up very well for the rest of your career in education. And it doesn't give people the kind of foundation they need for tertiary education and the world of work, which has all kinds of implications for South Africa and its future. If we can go to the next slide, please. So there's a kind of a toxic mix in South Africa. And we have this kind of vicious circle. So we have very high unemployment rates, which is currently about 32.9% under the official rate and 42.4% on the expanded definition. There's also quite stark differences amongst various population groups in South Africa, with Black people being far more likely to be unemployed than other racial groups. There's also some big differences in regions. You're far more likely to be unemployed if you live in a rural area than you live in a city or a town. And if you live, say, example, in rural Eastern Cape, far more likely to be unemployed than you live in Cape Town or in Johannesburg, for example. But this very high unemployment rate is made worse by labor laws, which also encourage violent strikes, which themselves deter job creations and then price the unskilled out of work, which then obviously leads to very high unemployment rates. And we have this kind of terrible cycle which perpetuates itself. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So there's a couple of things in South Africa which are causing, seeing the problems that we have today. I mean, there's a pervasive family breakdown, which we all know about. We see that about 70% of Black children grow up in households, in single-parent households. And there's been enough studies to be done that show what the benefits are to growing up in a household with both parents, or at least where your father's, or where both parents are very involved, not necessarily the father. Obviously, not all children only live with the mother. Some children only live with their father. There's also issues of electricity shortages. We don't have to go into that. Everybody knows about that. And this energy crisis is compounded by general government inefficiency on management and infrastructure, and maintenance of vital economic and social infrastructure. We also have a limited and struggling small business sector, which is struggling to thrive in an environment of low growth, poor skills, and suffocating red tape. We know from work that's been done in places like South Korea and Germany and so on that small businesses are a real engine in growing your economy. And South Africa is actually quite limited. It's also given the size of our economy and how many small businesses there are and how many people they employ. That's something we certainly have to look at. And there's also a mistaken reliance on affirmative action measures, which, like all these kind of measures around the world, whether they're in Malaysia or certain states in India, for example, they generally benefit a relatively small elite while bypassing the poor. And race-based employment equity and BE policies are failing their intended beneficiaries. We can see that in the high levels of unemployment amongst Black South Africans, the high levels of inequality amongst Black South Africans. If we look at inequality broken down within a race group, Black South Africans have the highest in-group inequality, and white South Africans have the lowest. And also, it's only Black South Africans where inequality has actually been growing over the past few years, which seems to indicate that the kind of benefits that accrue from BE and employment equity and so on only going to a relatively small elite. So I make of that what you will. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So what the Institute of Race Relations has suggested is something called economic empowerment for the disadvantaged. So we don't believe there's any need for an Amendment Act and draft regulations, which, as we've said, are unconstitutional. There are far more effective means to promote upward mobility and provide redress for past injustices. So what we've proposed is this other model, which we believe would be far more successful than current employment equity and BE policies in liberating the poor. As we said, this is the economic empowerment for the disadvantaged, and it's got three kind of prongs. One of these, there'd be an economic empowerment for there'd be a scorecard for economic empowerment for the disadvantaged. One thing how we would do that is through companies would have scorecards, and they'd be given points depending how much they've kind of contributed to the economy, how many people they've employed, and so on. And we wouldn't be looking at at simple brute force racial targets to see how people are being empowered. And if we can go to the next slide, please. We also propose a tax-funded voucher system. This would be given to South Africans based on means testing, and it would be given for education, healthcare, and housing. The vouchers would be funded by redirecting, not increasing, budgets of government departments. And, for example, tax-funded education departments would give parents a choice in what school they want to send their children to. They'd be given a certain amount that can obviously be decided. It would probably be something like the average amount spent on each child by the education department, and then parents could choose any school that they want to send their child to and provide these vouchers to the school. School would then use those vouchers to be reimbursed by the department, and obviously people could top up those vouchers if they would like. And as we say, they'd be means tested, and this would we believe this would see quite a lot of competition among schools. Trying to get the business, so to speak, of voucher-bearing parents, which would give an incentive to improve the quality of education. We've already seen there's been such a big increase in the growth of private schools across South Africa in the last 20 years, which I think, and this is, and this isn't just your St. John's or your St. Stithians or your Bishops. These are private schools that are aimed at people on lower incomes, and these schools have seen such a massive increase in the number of them and the number of kids going to those schools. We also think there could be a similar approach with things such as healthcare and housing, and I think that's quite a relevant topic now when we talking about things such as the NHI to try increase access to decent healthcare for people. We obviously don't think NHI is the solution, but we think these vouchers could be one way we could look at it. So yeah, thanks for that. That brings us to the end of our presentation. And if there are any questions, you can put them in the chat and we will be happy to take them. Cool. Well, if we don't have any questions, then I think, yeah, just let people know that they can support our campaign on the opposition to racial quotas. They can go to our website and just go to irr.org.za and you can look under our campaign section and you'll be able to sorry, I'm just doing questions there. We will be, so people can go to our website and they can join the campaign and give us their support, which is obviously quite important. And I will go to the questions on. There's one question. Isn't the IRR finding itself out of step with the global movement towards equity? I don't know if that is true. I do think there's some pushback against it. And I don't think we should be too concerned if we find ourselves out of step with the global movement. I think it's important to stick to an organization's principles. And the Institute of Race Relations has opposed race-based policy in any form since 1929. And equity, in a way, is definitely an example of race-based policy. And as we've said, we don't believe you need race-based policy to help Black South Africans. There are a lot of other ways to help Black South Africans without focusing on a person's race or the level of melanin in their skin. Would you like to add to that, Mlondi?
Yes, well, Marius, I definitely do agree because, these race-based laws are just a way to socially engineer a society. So we can't allow that. We've been fighting against this. We did fight against this, in the dark days of apartheid, and we will continue doing so now.
And there's a question from Bernice Barber. What is the expected timeline on the court challenge? Mlondi, I think you know a little bit more about that than I do. If you could tell Bernice.
Yes. So thank you very much for your question, Bernice. We are currently consulting our lawyers. We are, with regards to that, we are basically on the right track. We are consulting our lawyers, and we will provide, the public, an update by the coming week. So say about in 2 weeks' time, we will provide you with a detailed update. But just so you know, we are going to be challenging the amendment EA as well as the draft regulations.
Thanks, Mlondi. So we will definitely, as Mlondi says, Bernice, we will be keeping everybody up to date and letting everybody know what will be happening with that. I think this is, as we said in the presentation, I think this is some of the most absurd laws that the ANC government has brought in since 1994, and it basically takes us back to a time when people had to, classify themselves by race, which hasn't been something we've had since 1991. It was actually when the Population Registration Act was repealed. So it's actually terrible that 30 years after the end of apartheid, or 30 years after this terrible piece of legislation was repealed, that it's sort of coming back by stealth. So we see a question from Olani Cleo Majola. He says, I hope your objectivity will remain intact. As much as there are pros, there are also cons that will need addressing on equal measure. I'm not too sure what you mean by that question, Olani. But yeah, obviously, we will be hopefully, or whatever kind of policy we'll be pushing for, will hopefully be one that only has pros and not too many cons. We obviously don't want to push any policies that we think are bad or that have any cons. I don't have anything to add to that, Mlondi.
No, I don't. We will definitely be pushing policies that are pro, that are pro South Africa and pro non-racialism. That's what I can say.
Okay, let's give it another minute or two. If we don't have any more questions, I think can wrap up. And let me just emphasize that if people want to support our initiative, you can go to irr.org.za. There's other campaigns that we pushing, working against, that we think are bad for South Africa and for South Africans, such as the current push for NHI, which we think is also quite a very poorly thought out policy, and which one that certainly has been funded, and which is, it's also not a very good one. Same as the expropriation bill, which we think is quite an assault on property rights, which we think is a cornerstone of any functioning democratic society. Without property rights, kind of is the foundation for a lot of other rights, actually, when you get down to it. And any attack on the importance of property rights is something that we'll be pushing against. Something that I think a lot of people also forget is that one of the things that made that made apartheid so terrible was that Black South Africans were in many ways denied their property rights. They didn't have security of where they stayed. They could easily get, they couldn't own their property or the land they were on, and that's often what, as I say, that was one of the most insidious elements of apartheid. Same as race classification, which we're fighting against there. So I think a lot of these bad policies can be traced back to even worse policies that we had, prior to 1994. I don't know if you want to add to that, Mlondi.
No, there's nothing pretty much to add. I think you've covered it all, Marius.
Cool. Well, if that's, I think if we don't have any more questions, then yeah, as I say, if you can just go, if you're interested in supporting our work, go to irr.org.za. You'll be able to find all the information there. And yeah, and if you like what you're doing, please share our work on various social media or with your friends and your colleagues. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining. And I hope you found it interesting. And if you could support the work that we're doing.